The wall of black cloud came across the Wyoming sky faster than any horse could run. It swallowed the pale November afternoon in one long breath, the light going out of the country from north to south, the way a lamp goes out when somebody puts a hand over the chimney. Below it, on an empty rise above the Powder River Trail, a freight wagon leaned hard onto its broken front axle, the cracked oak jutting into the frozen grass like a snapped bone. A single mule stood in the harness, with her ears flat against her skull, her eyes locked on the northern horizon. She did not pull. She did not shy or stamp or fight the traces. She simply stood the way animals stand for things older than fear, and she would not take one more step toward what was coming. The woman beside her never looked at the wagon. She looked only at the sky. And what frightened her was not the cloud. It was the silence underneath it. The air had gone completely still, not a blade of dry grass moving, not one crow calling from the sandstone bluffs a quarter-mile east. She had heard that silence once before in a valley below the Bighorn foothills, when she was still a girl and the men who ignored it that day never came home to be buried. Her name was Winifred Ashcroft. She was 31 years old, and in about 4 hours she was going to do something that 19 other people on that trail would not live long enough to learn from. She had left Miles City 6 mornings ago with everything she still owned lashed into the bed of that wagon, which was not much, which was in fact the entire problem, because a month before she had owned a trading post with a 2-room house behind it, a smokehouse, a fenced paddock where she had once taught a colt to come to her voice alone, and a copper coffee mill her husband bought her for their 5th anniversary. Now she owned a mule, a toolbox, 2 blankets, and a wagon that had just stopped being a wagon. Elias Ashcroft had died the previous February, coughing his lungs out in the loft above the store 4 days after wading chest deep into a drift by the river to cut 3 head of cattle loose. He had done it because they were his cattle and because he did not know how to leave an animal in trouble. That was the whole of Elias in one sentence: a good man with a soft heart and a poor head for money. Winifred had believed that February that grief had already taken everything a widow could lose. She learned by October that grief had only opened the door. The man who walked through it afterward wore a black wool coat and carried a leather portfolio, and he had come all the way from Chicago on the Northern Pacific and then south by hired stage. His name was Cornelius Vantrees. He was perhaps 45 narrow through the shoulders, and he had the manner of a man who had never in his life needed to raise his voice about anything. I did not raise it in her kitchen either. He never once insulted her memory of Elias. He never suggested she was a foolish woman or an ignorant one. He simply sat at her scrub pine table with his hat on his knee and set document after document across the wood one at a time, with the patience of a man laying floor tile, turning each page toward her, waiting while she read it through, then laying down the next. Loan of $1,100, 1879. Renewal, 1880. Consolidation with a second note, 1881. Extension, 1882. Extension, 1883. Every one of them in Elias's careful hand. Every signature curling at the E the way his always had. The room got smaller with every sheet. 30 days to vacate. Everything from the cast iron stove to the copper coffee mill would go against the balance owed to creditors in a state she had never seen. Vantrees explained the arithmetic twice kindly because he wanted to be certain she understood it. Then he stood and he took up his hat, and at the door he removed it and held it against his chest for a moment before he stepped out into the street. That was somehow worse than everything else. She thought about it for weeks afterward, the small courtesy of it, the hat coming off. A man does that when he wants you to know he is not enjoying this. She would see that gesture twice more in her life. Once described to her by a 60-year-old carpenter in a stranger's parlor, and once in a courthouse corridor in Cheyenne, and by the second time she would understand precisely what it was worth. But the hat was not the thing that broke her. The thing that broke her was on the last page. She found it on the 4th night alone, after the neighbors had stopped coming by and the lamp had burned down twice. She had been reading everything in the house because there was nothing else left to do with her hands. And at the bottom of the stack beneath the notes and the extensions and the schedule of chattel was a single sheet dated the 11th of April, 1881. Release of dower. She could read the words. She could not read what they meant. That was the thing about a document like that, and she would come to understand it better than almost anybody alive. The words were English. Every one of them was a word she knew. But release of dower was 3 of them in a row, and the row meant something that none of the 3 said, and there was nobody in Miles City who could tell her what except the schoolmaster. She walked down there the next morning in the rain. Fenny Moore, Sledge was 71 years old with cataracts in both eyes, and he had to hold the sheet 6 inches from his face, and he read it aloud to her slowly, and then explained it in the voice of a man delivering a diagnosis. A wife could not sign a note. The law did not permit it. Whatever a married woman owned became her husband's the day she married him, and whatever debt he made was his alone, and there was exactly one document in the whole of American property law that a wife was required to sign with her own hand. This one. Without it, a man could not mortgage the roof his wife slept under. The law protected her that far. It protected her from her own husband. It gave her one wall and one wall only, and it required her to take that wall down herself before anybody could come through it. Winifred stood in the rain outside the schoolmaster's door for a long time, because she remembered that morning. The 11th of April, 1881, a Monday. She had been at the counter weighing out flour into paper sacks for a family heading up to the mussel shell, and the scale had been running heavy, and she had been irritated about it. Elias had come through from the back with a sheaf of papers in his hand and set them down beside the scale and said something about a railroad order. The freight consignment for the spring shipment sign at the bottom of each, they want it back on the eastbound. And she had said, "Put your finger on the line, I've got flour on my hands." And he had put his finger on the line, and she had signed 4 sheets without lifting her eyes from the scale and gone on weighing flour. And that was the last thought she had ever given it. 3 years and 7 months later, a man from Chicago had used the 4th of those sheets to take the house out from under her, and there was not one thing in the law of the United States that could be done about it, because the signature was hers and it was valid and she had made it herself. She did not cry that night. She went home and she lit the lamp and she pulled the entire stack of papers back across the table toward her, and she began at page 1. And for 30 days, while the neighbors watched from across the muddy street with their arms folded, while a few of them offered small prayers through the fence rails, while others muttered that a widow with no children could not possibly winter in Wyoming. By her own hand, Winifred Ashcroft sat at that scrub pine table every night and read every word of every document in her house. Not to find a way out. There was no way out. She had checked and the schoolmaster had checked and there wasn't one. She read them because she had made herself a promise on the schoolmaster's step in the rain, and it was the only promise she had left to make. "I will never again sign a thing I have not read." It took her the better part of a month. She read the notes and the extensions and the chattel schedules. She read the fine paragraphs at the bottom that nobody reads, the ones set in type so small she had to bring the lamp right down onto the page. She read them until she understood the shape of how such a document was built, where the teeth were, where the language turned, which clause was doing the actual work, while the rest of it sat there, looking respectable. She did not know it that October, but she was not reading a stack of papers. She was learning a man's habits. And in a courthouse in Cheyenne 5 months later, that would be the only weapon she had. She had one brother left anywhere on the map. Everyone else was accounted for by a grave. Her mother had gone into a cholera trench outside Sandusky before Winifred was old enough to remember the shape of the woman's face. Her father lay under a granite marker in the Black Hills dead 5 years that autumn, the fall of 1879 in the second week of October, at 57 years old, of a chest that had been troubling him on cold mornings for 2 winters, and that he never once mentioned to a doctor. Her brother had written from Buffalo, Wyoming, promising her a place at his hearth if she ever needed one. The letter had reached her 3 months late, delayed by a mail contractor who lost half a season's route somewhere between Cheyenne and the Bighorn Basin, and by the time she read her brother's cramped handwriting, the aspens above Miles City had already turned. Waiting for spring meant starving through a winter with no store, no credit, and no roof past the 30th day. Traveling now meant 60 miles of open country in November. She had chosen the road because the road at least still belonged to her. The axle had cracked 2 days back at a rocky crossing of Sage Creek, going with a report like a rifle shot in the still morning air. She had repaired it herself, kneeling in ice water up to her calves with a strip of green rawhide and 2 hardwood wedges out of her father's toolbox, while Thistle stood patient on the bank and watched her work. That repair had held for a day and a half. Now it was finished, and so was the wagon, and the sky was doing the thing her father had spent half his life teaching her never to ignore. Winifred climbed onto the broken driver's box one final time and stood there, letting the height give her a wider view of the country. West, the storm, building its shoulders, the underside of it already curling downward like the crest of a wave preparing to break. Nothing useful in that direction. North along the ridgeline, frozen grass, sage the long empty rolls of country going up toward the bighorns. No cabin smoke rising from any draw. No cottonwood grove tall enough to break a wind. No lantern flicker from any homestead. 60 miles between her and the nearest settlement worth the name, and 60 miles can feel like 600 when a Wyoming blizzard begins to move. Then something caught her eye low and east, tucked beneath a shelf of weathered sandstone the color of old butter. A darker shape carved into the rock. Not a cave, more like the shadow of a room. She narrowed her eyes against the failing light and held very still, and something moved in her chest that was not quite hope, but was close enough to it that her breath caught. Because she had seen that shape before. 16 years earlier, her father had brought her along on a freight run from Deadwood down to Fort Laramie, because his wife had been in the ground 13 years by then, and there was nobody else to raise the girl but him. Barnaby Thorogood was 46 that summer, and she was 15 tall for her age, quiet in the way girls get quiet when they learn early that the world does not slow down for tears. On that trip, he taught her how to lash a load so it would ride through a thunderstorm without shifting. He taught her to read a mule's ears, the way a preacher reads scripture. He taught her that the low ground is where you go when a black cloud comes over the ridge, and that the smell of the air changes an hour before the wind does, and that a man who trusts a clear sky in November has decided to gamble with something he cannot afford to lose. And halfway down the trail at a place where two dry washes came together beneath a red rock overhang, he stopped the wagon in the middle of the afternoon for no reason she could see and walked her over to what looked like nothing at all. Just a scoop in the sandstone the size of a small parlor. He put one gloved hand flat against the cold rock. "This is where I slept for 2 nights in the storm of '71, he said. She asked him what happened to the men he had been riding with. Her father looked at her for a long moment with eyes the same pale blue as her own. "They didn't wait," he said. Then he climbed back into the wagon and drove on, and he did not say another word about it for the rest of that trip. Winifred stood on the broken driver's box of her own wagon in November of 1884 and understood 2 things at once, and the second one was worse than the first. The first was that her father had given her this. The hollow under the shelf, the habit of looking for it, the knowledge that such a thing was even worth looking for. All of that was his handed down on a summer afternoon to a girl who had not understood what she was being handed. The second was that he had never told her what to do once she got there, because he had not needed to know. Barnaby Thorogood had walked into that scoop in the sandstone in 1871 with an intact freight wagon, a full canvas cover, 4 mules, and 2 men who had made the same decision he had. He had shelter and gear and hands to help him. She had a wagon with a broken back, a mule, a toolbox, and about 90 minutes of light. Her father had shown her the door. Nobody had ever shown her how to close it. She climbed down. Thistle followed without being pulled, the reins loose in Winifred's fist, and together they crossed the frozen grass toward the sandstone bluff, boots and hooves breaking through a crust so thin it barely held their weight. The closer they came, the larger the hollow appeared. It faced east. That was the first mercy. The wind would come out of the northwest, and this opening turned its back on it and everything. Winifred knew about weather, said that the difference between an east-facing hole and a north-facing one was the difference between a shelter and a chimney. The heavy rock above curved outward, like the roof of a shed porch, throwing a deep shadow across a patch of packed sand the color of pale rust. 3 sides were already closed, solid stone unbroken, older than any wall a human being could build. Winifred stepped inside. Her boots scraped on dry earth instead of snow. That struck her almost like a sound from another season. She pressed her bare palm against the cool interior wall and held it there, feeling for a tremor or a hidden fissure, testing it the way you test a beam before you trust your weight to it. The rock did not move. It had the particular stillness of something that had held its ground through longer winters than she could count. Through the storm of 1871 and the storm of 1855, and 1,000 storms before any white man had ever set eyes on this country. 3 walls. Her breathing slowed for the first time in an hour. Then she turned toward the opening, and the arithmetic arrived, and her breathing stopped again. One side stood open. A rectangle of gray sky and dying light framed by the natural rim of the sandstone 12 feet across and better than 5 feet high. An opening that size in a wind like the one coming would not simply let the cold in. It would let the shelter breathe out. Every bit of warmth that came off her body, or the mules would go straight through that gap and out into Montana, and the wind would pull more behind it. And by 3 in the morning, she would be sitting in a stone room that was exactly as cold as the prairie and considerably darker. 3 walls were not a shelter. 3 walls were a promise that needed a fourth. She turned and looked back up the ridge at the wreck of her wagon, tipped at its wounded angle against a horizon the color of iron shavings. Most travelers would have looked at that wagon and seen splintered timber, kindling if they were being generous. Winifred Ashcroft looked at it and saw the missing wall. Then she looked at the ground between here and there, and the distance suddenly felt a great deal longer than it had a moment ago. She ran the numbers without saying them aloud, the way her father had taught her to run numbers on a loading dock. The wagon bed stripped of its wheels and running gear. Oak planking, iron banding at the corners, the whole of it somewhere near 120 pounds. Downhill the entire way, which helped, and over frozen grass, which helped more. 400 yards, which helped not at all. No draft horse to hitch. Thistle could have dragged it in 10 minutes, but Thistle was a saddle-broke mule in a wagon harness, and the harness itself was buckled to a running gear pinned under the load, and unrigging all of that and reworking it to pull a bare bed would cost her the better part of an hour she did not have. She could see the arithmetic of it as clearly as if it were written down. The wind would be here in 90 minutes. The wagon bed had to be across that opening before the wind was. No neighbors along this stretch. No passing rider. Nobody at all in any direction for as far as the failing light would let her see. She tied Thistle inside the hollow beside a twisted cedar growing out of a crack in the rock, its roots older than any homestead in the territory. The mule lowered her head against Winifred's chest without resisting, and Winifred put both hands on that long face for a moment and felt the warm breath coming through the velvet muzzle. "I'll come back." The promise sounded thin in her own ears. Thistle blinked once and stood quietly, which was the closest thing to an answer she was going to get. Then she turned and ran uphill toward the broken wagon, her wool skirt gathered in one fist, her boots slipping twice on the frost-glazed slope. Behind her, the first true breath of wind finally crossed the prairie. Not the killing wind. Not yet. Just enough to lift a thin ribbon of loose snow off the frozen ground and send it hissing sideways through the sage. Her father had told her about that too. The first snow never attacks, it only measures. She reached the wagon out of breath, her chest burning, and stood for exactly 5 seconds looking at the problem. Then she went to work because there was no other kind of work left to do. The wheels came off first. The linchpins fought her frozen fingers for nearly a full minute apiece. She had to work each one with the flat of her father's chisel and the heel of her hand, and the second one took skin off her knuckle when it finally let go. Front left, front right. She rolled each wheel aside and let it fall flat so the wind would not take it. The rear wheels she left. She did not need the bed level. She needed it off. She hauled her trunk out and dropped it in the grass. Clothing blankets, a wedding quilt she had not been able to make herself leave in Miles City, and shoved it aside without ceremony. She unstrapped her father's toolbox from its place behind the driver's platform, the leather stiff with cold. She gathered every scrap of torn canvas, still hanging from the boughs, working the frozen straps loose one by one, then pulling the last of it free by main force when the buckles would not give. She unhitched the singletree and coiled her rope around her waist. Then she got under the front bolster with her shoulder and her whole weight and heaved. The bed came off the running gear with a shriek of dry wood and dropped onto the frozen ground with a hollow thump she felt through her boots. Winifred looped the rope twice around the front. Bolster ran the ends over both shoulders and across her chest, the way a man harnesses himself to a stone boat, and leaned into it. Nothing happened. The oak sat exactly where it had landed. It had frozen down in the 90 seconds since it dropped a rim of ice already forming along the underside, where the warmth of the timber had melted the crust and then let it lock. She widened her stance. She dug her heels through the frost into the grass roots beneath. She leaned until the rope came up hard across her collarbone, and she could feel her own pulse in her ears, and she pulled. Her boot slipped. She went down on one knee hard enough to send a bright bloom of pain up through her hip, and the rope burned across her shoulder as it took her weight in the fall. Winifred Ashcroft knelt in the frozen grass on an empty ridge in Wyoming territory with 120 pounds of dead oak behind her and a wall of black cloud in front of her, and she stayed there for 3 long breaths. Then she got her boot back under her, lowered herself another inch, and pulled with everything left in her 31-year-old body. The wagon bed moved. It came with a long, scraping groan that echoed off the sandstone below her and came back across the empty ridge like the voice of something waking up. 2 inches, maybe 3. But it moved. She did not look back. She simply kept walking downhill in a bent-over crouch, one careful step at a time, breath coming out of her in thick white clouds that were snatched away as fast as she made them, every slow stride carving another shallow groove through the frozen grass behind her. The blizzard did not announce itself. It began with whispers. Thin white streaks came skimming across the ground, almost gently, almost beautifully, like frost breath from something enormous just over the horizon. The light went from pewter to something lower. The temperature dropped so fast she felt it in her teeth. She counted steps instead of thinking about the distance. 20, 40, 60. The rope burned through her coat where it crossed her collarbone. Her breathing turned rough at the back of her throat, and she made herself slow it, because a person who starts gasping in air that cold will be coughing blood by midnight. At 150 yards, her knees folded under her again, and the wagon bed stopped with a grinding shudder. She stayed on both hands and knees for several seconds while her breath settled. Her shoulders were shaking not from weakness, she told herself, but from carrying more than any one person is built to carry alone. Her palms were raw where the rope had abraded through her leather mittens without her noticing. She reached inside her coat for the canteen, and her fingers brushed something else. 2 letters in the inner pocket. One from Elias, written to her the summer before he died from a cattle drive, up near the muscle shelf, folded so many times the creases had worn through into little white windows of nothing. The other she had never opened. It had been lying under the tools in her father's toolbox since the morning she left Miles City, and she had found it only that same morning while she was digging for a length of spare rope. The paper was yellow with age. It was sealed with a smear of dark red wax that bore no imprint at all. Her name was written across the front in her father's steady hand, the same hand she remembered from every list, every letter, every carefully lettered sign he had ever tacked to a shop wall. She had turned it over twice that morning, and then Thistle had shifted in the traces, and the light had been going, and there had been 60 miles to cover. There had been no time to read it then. There was no time now either. Winifred pressed the paper flat against her chest through the layers of wool and canvas, feeling the small, stiff square of it there like a warm coal. Then she stood up and set her shoulder against the rope again. The bed scraped forward another yard, then another. Behind her, the wind finally found its full voice. It came over the ridge with a long, hollow sound that rolled down across the prairie, the way freight cars sound when they are still a mile out on the plains at night, and it did not stop after it passed. It just kept coming layer on layer like something enormous, drawing a breath that had no end to it. Thistle answered from inside the rock with one sharp, ragged bray. "I'm coming," Winifred said. She was not sure whether it was meant for the mule or for herself or for someone else entirely. By the time she reached the sandstone shelf, the daylight had gone to a dull pewter that made her own hands look like they belonged to somebody dead. The cold had begun reaching through her wool skirt and her long johns to the skin underneath, and she was no longer entirely sure how much time had passed. She dragged the wagon bed the last 20 feet and hauled it sideways across the entrance in one final heaving effort that left her sitting in the sand with her back against it, chest-heaving seeing spots. Then she looked at what she had done. The wagon bed covered the middle third of the opening. That was all. A gap of better than 2 feet stood open on the left where the sandstone curved outward. Another on the right wider. And a long horizontal slot ran the entire width of the opening above the wagon bed, between the top plank and the underside of the stone overhang, wide enough to put both arms through. 3 gaps, 3 open invitations for the wind to come in and finish what it had started. Snow was already banking in the corners of the hollow, carried in on stray gusts that curled around the timber and dropped it wherever the air went still. Winifred did not spend 1 second on despair. She had learned young that panic burns more of a person than labor ever does. She climbed onto the frame and reached for the torn canvas. Her fingers had gone half stupid with cold, and the straps had frozen solid overnight before. Nothing gave. She braced her boot against the sideboard and pulled until the first strap cracked free like a pistol shot, and then the second, and then she was dragging a heavy frozen sheet of canvas up and over the top of the wagon bed and stretching it across the upper gap. The wind caught it at once. It snapped and cracked and tried to take the whole sheet out of her hands and up over the bluff, and Winifred threw her entire body across one edge and held it flat while she worked flat stones out of the floor of the hollow with her free hand and wedged them into the cracks in the sandstone along the top. Stone by stone, corner by corner, the cloth stopped moving. Only the 2 side gaps remained. She turned toward the hillside. Dry bunch grass covered the slope in thick brown clumps that had gone brittle with frost. She grabbed 2 handfuls and pulled. The roots resisted, frozen into the soil. She threw her weight back and pulled harder, and the clump released with a soft, ripping sound and came up with a small circle of dirt still gripped in its roots. She carried armful after armful back to the entrance. And here she did the thing that Wendell Pruitt, a man who had been putting up outbuildings in that country for 40 years, and who did not yet know she existed, would later say he could not have thought of himself. She did not simply stuff the grass into the gaps. She wove it. She took each handful and worked it into the seams sideways, crossing the stems one over another, packing each new layer against the last, at an angle the way her father had taught her to weave rushes into the seat of a chair on a winter afternoon in the Black Hills, when she was 11 years old and bored and had asked him for something to do with her hands. Straw stuffed loose into a hole blows out. Straw woven into a hole binds against itself and holds. She had not thought about that chair in 20 years. She packed until no daylight showed through anywhere. Then she went back over the entire seam with the back of her bare hand, moving it slowly along every inch of the joint between rock and timber, feeling for moving air. Where she felt cold, she added more grass. Where the seam felt still, she moved on. It took her a long time, and it was the most important work she did that day, and somewhere in the middle of it, she noticed that her fingertips had stopped hurting altogether. She made herself stop. Feeling nothing in weather like this is never good news. She rubbed both hands together hard, then shoved them inside her coat and up under her arms against her ribs, and stood there in the half-dark counting until a dull sting came back into them and then a burning that made her eyes water. Only then did she keep working. The storm did not wait for her to finish. Snow began striking the outside of the wagon bed in fast, dry bursts that sounded like handfuls of sand thrown against a window pane. Thistle shifted farther back into the hollow hooves, silent on the packed sand, and stood with her head lowered and her breath going out in long plumes. And slowly, so slowly that Winifred registered the change before she understood what it was. The air inside the hollow stopped biting the inside of her nose. It was still cold. It would be cold all night. But something had changed in it. The stone held what little heat there was. The mule added more. 800 pounds of animal breathing in a room the size of a small parlor is not nothing. And neither is one woman who has just spent an hour hauling a wagon bed 400 yards. Her father had told her that once, sitting in the front room of their cabin on a January evening with his boots off and his feet toward the stove. Survival isn't always about making heat. Sometimes it's only about refusing to lose the heat you already carry. Winifred stepped back and looked at what she had built. In daylight, it would have been embarrassing. Broken timber lashed with fraying rope. Frozen canvas held down by rocks. Dead grass shoved into every seam like the nest of some enormous bird. Any freighter or homesteader passing that bluff in fair weather would have laughed out loud. She did not need it to look strong. She needed it to stay closed until morning. The first full blast of the blizzard hit the cliff a few minutes later. The sound of it shook the rock under her boots. Snow exploded across the entrance in a white detonation that turned the canvas gray and then bowed it inward 6 inches. The stretched cloth pulled taut against its stones. The packed grass shivered in its seams. For one long second, she was certain something was going to tear loose, and the whole night would go with it. She stood very still, watching every joint, listening for the high, thin whistle that would mean air had found a path through a place it should not be. The wind fell away. Nothing had opened. The wall held. She let out a breath she had not known she was holding. And it was not because the danger had passed, because it had not passed and would not pass for 15 hours. It was because for the first time since she had watched a black cloud come across the sky faster than any horse could run, she had one honest chance. She spread her 2 wool blankets on the dry sandstone in the back corner where the rock curved deepest and set out. What food she had beside them: a hard-tack tin, 3 strips of dried venison, half a loaf of biscuit, gone hard enough to break teeth, a small round of cheese, a paper twist of coarse salt. She put the canteen against the rock wall where the stone might slow the water freezing. Then she pulled her father's toolbox onto her lap and opened it for the first time since Miles City. His hammer, the handle worn smooth and slightly hollow from 40 years of one particular grip. His flat wood chisel. His handsaw with the blade wrapped in oiled cloth so the teeth would not rust. A steel and flint in the corner pocket. A brass signaling mirror also wrapped because Barnaby Thorogood had believed that a man who could not keep his own tools in order had no business calling himself a craftsman. Every item exactly where he had last set it down 5 years ago in a shed outside Deadwood by a man who had not known he was putting them away for the last time. And beneath all of it, the folded letter. Outside, the wind rose against the sandstone, and the snow hissed across the canvas in a steady, sibilant rush. Winifred unfolded the paper with fingers still stiff from the cold, and by the last dim gray light leaking through one small unsealed corner of the covering, she read the 6 words written across the top in her father's steady hand. "For the day you stand alone." She sat with that line long enough for the wind outside to change pitch twice. She had known Barnaby Thorogood her entire life, and she recognized the sound of him in those 6 words the way she would have recognized his step on a porch. Her throat closed. She let it. Then the light went out of that seam entirely, and she could not read another word without a lamp, and she was not yet ready to spend the oil. She folded the page back along its old creases and held it against her chest in the dark. She did not know that in about an hour she would see 6 figures on the ridge above her walking a line that would carry them past this bluff and out into open country where nothing at all stands between a person and the wind. She did not know that saving them would cost her the exact fuel she had been counting on to get herself through the night, and that she would have to decide about it in the time it takes to draw 2 breaths. She did not know that one of the men on that ridge had put his mark on a mortgage in Nebraska 3 years earlier, drawn up in the hand of a man named Cornelius Vantrees, and that he had signed it because Vantrees read it aloud to him, because Wendell Pruitt had spent 60 years on this earth without ever learning to read a page of it himself. She did not know that Vantrees had skipped a paragraph. She did not know that she was the only person in Wyoming territory who had spent 30 consecutive nights learning exactly which paragraph a man like that would skip. All she knew in the last of the light on the 21st of November in 1884 was that there were 3 walls of sandstone at her back that had stood since before her country had a name, in one wall of broken oak and frozen canvas and woven grass in front of her that she had built with her own 2 hands in 90 minutes. And that the second one was holding. She lit the lantern eventually because a person cannot sit in the dark that long without going somewhere in her own head that she has no business going. She turned the wick down as low as it would burn and read the rest of the first page by that. "My dear Winifred, if you are reading this, then the day has come that every father hopes will never find his daughter. I have written this letter 3 times and burned it 3 times because putting it into your hands felt the same as admitting I would not be there to say the words myself. But I am 57 years old this fall, and my chest has begun to trouble me on cold mornings, and a man who tells himself he will live forever has stopped being useful to the people who love him. So I'm writing it a 4th time, and this time I will not burn it. I will put it beneath the tools because I know you, and I know that on the day you need this letter, the box will already be in your hands." Winifred put her hand over her mouth. Outside, the storm made a sound like a locomotive coming through a tunnel, and the sound seemed very far away now at the other end of some long corridor she had walked into without noticing. A storm is never your enemy because of its strength. It only becomes dangerous when it convinces you to spend your own strength fighting it. She stopped there and read that line twice. It sounded exactly like him. Plain, simple, useful. No speeches, no grand lessons. Only truth that had been earned across a lifetime of hard winters in a country where a man's philosophy got tested every time he stepped out his own door. Find something stronger than yourself. Stand beside it. Use what already exists before you spend one breath building what does not. Winifred lifted her eyes slowly to the sandstone walls around her. 3 of them had been standing here before the Republic existed. She had added one, and even that one was made out of a wagon she had not built. Her father had been teaching her this for 16 years. She was only understanding it tonight. She read 2 more paragraphs, and then she stopped because her eyes had gone hot, and the letters were beginning to swim, and because a woman who lets tears freeze on her face in that kind of cold will lose skin when she wipes them off. She folded the page and put it back inside her coat. She would come back to it. There were 4 more pages, but not yet. Then the wagon bed shook. It was not the wind. She knew the difference immediately. The wind came in long pressures that pushed the whole wall inward and let it back out again, like something breathing against it. This was a single heavy thump wood struck by something with weight behind it, and it came in low and dragged along the outside of the timber before falling away. Thistle came up off her doze with her ears swinging forward. Winifred set the letter aside and slid her hand across the sand until her fingers closed on the handle of her father's hammer. The sound came again, lower this time. A long scrape down the length of the planking, ending in a soft thud somewhere near the base. Wood groaned. The canvas tightened overhead. Then silence, the particular kind of silence that makes a person's own heartbeat sound louder than it has any right to. She did not move for what felt like a full minute. She was thinking about wolves, She was thinking about a black bear a freighter had told her about in Miles City one that had come down out of the Bighorn starving in late fall and killed a man's horse inside the man's own corral. She was thinking about the plain fact that her father's hammer, however well made, was still only a hammer against anything larger than a man. She rose to a crouch and moved one careful step toward the small, unsealed corner near the top of the covering. She did not pull anything away. She only set one eye against the gap and held her breath. Nothing. Blowing snow-white sheets racing past so thick they hid everything beyond a few yards. Then the sound came a third time closer and she saw it. A dark shape rolled across her field of vision, low and round, and vanished into the storm. Another followed it a moment later. A tumbleweed, dry and enormous, torn off some fence line out on the plains and driven against the sandstone by the wind, striking the wagon bed with a hollow thump and rolling on. She almost laughed. She did not quite have the breath for it. Instead, she pressed her forehead against the cold plank and closed her eyes for a moment. The danger outside was already large enough. Her own imagination did not need to enlist as a second enemy. She went back to the corner and sat down against the stone with the hammer still in her hand. And that was when she heard the voice. It was thin, shredded by the wind, before it could form itself into a whole word, and she was not certain she had heard anything at all. She stayed absolutely still. It came a second time. Winifred rose to a crouch and put her hand on Thistle's shoulder, listening past the roar for anything that might tell her whether she had imagined it. The mule's ears remained forward. That decided it. She had learned long ago that animals do not invent sounds the way frightened people do. She crawled to the covering and lifted one corner of the frozen canvas just enough to press her eye to the gap. The blizzard filled the world outside with a moving whiteness so complete she could not tell earth from sky. For a long moment she saw nothing at all. Then movement at the top of the ridge, small and dark against all that white. Figures. 6 of them, maybe more, strung out in a ragged line along the crest of the rise 150 yards above her. They leaned so far into the wind, they looked ready to fall sideways with every step. A horse dragged along behind them with no rider, its head down almost to its knees. A shape near the middle of the group stumbled and disappeared entirely into the blowing snow before struggling upright again with help from the 2 figures on either side. Winifred pressed her whole face against the gap, now both hands braced against the plank watching them. They were not coming toward the bluff. They were walking a long diagonal that would carry them past the sandstone hollow entirely and out into the open flats, where nothing at all stands between a person and the wind, and where a party on foot in a blizzard has perhaps 2 hours before it stops being a party at all. They had missed their landmark. She understood at once how it had happened, because she had almost done the same thing herself 4 hours earlier. From up on that ridge in that light, the hollow looked like nothing. It looked like more rock. She had walked past 100 such shadows in her own life without ever knowing what waited inside them. She waved one arm inside the shelter, a useless gesture that no one outside could possibly see, and then swore at herself under her breath for wasting even that much. The travelers kept moving. Every step took them farther from her. In 2 minutes, they would be past the bluff. After that, nothing she could do would reach them. She turned back into the hollow and moved fast. The brass signaling mirror lay in the bottom of the toolbox, wrapped in the same oiled cloth as the saw blade. She pulled it free and had it halfway up before her mind caught up to her hands. There was no sun. There had been no sun for 3 hours, and there would be none until morning. A signaling mirror without light is a piece of polished tin. She dropped it back into the box. The lantern sat by her blanket. She lifted it and shook it once. Kerosene sloshed against the reservoir, less than half full. And there it was the whole of the night in a single small sound. Burning that lantern now meant burning fuel she had budgeted to carry her through 15 hours of darkness. It also meant burning the air inside a shelter she had spent 90 minutes sealing shut. Every hour that flame burned would eat what she had built. Waiting meant that 6 people were going to walk into their own graves inside the next quarter hour. Her father had told her once that a person who spends too long choosing between 2 bad options usually ends up with a third one, and the third one is always worse than the first 2 put together. Winifred turned the wick up. She crossed to the covering, lifted the corner of the canvas, and pushed the lantern out through the gap. The wind grabbed at the flame and made it flutter, but it held. She raised it higher above the top edge of the wagon bed so the glow would spill out into the storm. Nothing changed on the ridge. She waved the lantern in a slow arc. The flame guttered inside the chimney and steadied. The figures kept walking. She waved it again wider. One traveler stopped. Another walked into him from behind and nearly went down. Winifred swung the lantern a third time. The lead figure raised an arm and pointed directly at the bluff, a tiny gesture almost lost in all that whiteness. And she saw it, and something came loose in her chest that was not quite hope, but was near enough to it that she had to press her forehead against the frozen plank for a moment. Then she understood in one clean flash of thought that it was not enough. The lead man had seen it. That did not mean the ones at the back had. Nobody at the tail of that line could see through their own eyelashes in this wind. And a party strung out over 40 yards in a blizzard does not turn on one man's arm. It turns when every person in it sees the same thing at the same time. She needed something bigger, something the storm could not eat. She pulled her head back inside, set the lantern on a flat rock where it could not tip, and went through her supplies until her hand closed on a coiled length of cotton rag she had been saving for wounds. The kerosene bottle was smaller than the lantern reservoir. It was also nearly full. One of the wagon bows had come loose when she stripped the canvas, a smooth piece of hickory as long as her arm lying in the sand where she had dropped it. She wound the cotton tight around one end. She soaked it in kerosene until the cloth went dark and heavy and the smell of it filled the hollow. She took her father's steel and flint out of the corner pocket of the toolbox and struck them together twice, 3 times, and on the fourth strike the cotton took the spark. Flame ran up the soaked cloth in a soft blue rush and then settled into a hard orange tongue nearly a foot long. Winifred stepped to the covering, pulled the canvas aside, and thrust the burning end out into the storm above the wagon bed. The wind hit the torch like a hand trying to pinch it out. The flame bent flat sideways and streamed, but the kerosene fed it faster than the wind could kill it. She held it as high as she could reach and swept it slowly through a wide arc. By daylight, it would have been nothing. In a Wyoming blizzard at dusk against the dark face of a sandstone bluff, it was a signal fire. And then she did the thing that Wendell Pruitt would still be describing to people 20 years later on a porch outside Buffalo, with his hands moving to show them how it worked. She reached back into the toolbox with her free hand and came out with the brass mirror. Her father had used that mirror to talk across a canyon in the Black Hills, angling the polished face to catch the sun and throw it 2 miles to a wagon on the far rim. She had watched him do it when she was 13. She had thought it was the finest thing she had ever seen. There was no sun tonight, there would be none. But there was a flame in her right hand. She brought the mirror around behind the torch and held it there, tilting the face until it caught the light coming off the burning cotton and threw it back outward, the polished brass gathering every scrap of that small fire and casting it forward into the snow. One source became 2. The mirror went warm against her palm within seconds. She felt the heat of the torch through her mitten and did not move her hand. Up on the ridge, the entire line of travelers stopped. The lead figure pointed again, and this time the pointing turned into motion. All 6 of them changed direction and began the slow, terrible descent down the frozen slope toward her. The descent was slower than she would have believed possible. The lead man broke trail with both arms out for balance, and even so he went to his knees twice before he reached level ground. Behind him, a woman lost her footing on the icy grass and skidded several yards down the slope before catching herself against a tuft of sage. Someone helped her up. Winifred could not see faces at that distance, only shapes wrapped in dark wool moving through a wall of white. The smallest figure went down hard about halfway to the bluff. The 2 travelers on either side stopped, lifted the small one back to standing, looped an arm around each shoulder, and came on again with that figure carried between them more than walking. Winifred's throat tightened. Not a small woman, a girl. Even at that distance through that wind, she could tell by the size. She swung the torch again to keep them oriented. The kerosene was burning down faster than she liked. 2 minutes of flame left, maybe less. And in those 2 minutes, she did the second thing that nobody had taught her. She pushed her way partway out through the gap in the covering into 30 below wind and driving snow in her coat and shirt sleeves, and she drove her boots deep into the fresh drift outside the entrance, stamping down hard, packing the snow into a firm print. Then a step forward and another, then another. 20 feet up the slope, 30 at the most. Because a torch shows a party where a place is. It does not show them how to get there. And the last 40 yards of that slope was scoured rock and glare ice, under 2 inches of powder, and a man who has been walking in a blizzard for 6 hours cannot see his own boots. And one bad step on that ground would put somebody's hip or ankle out and end them within sight of shelter. Packed snow holds. Loose snow blows away in 90 seconds. She was building a set of stairs the wind would need time to erase. She backed toward the shelter, stamping as she went, until she was inside the opening again with the torch still raised. The lead man reached the trail of prints first. He looked down at them, then up at the torch, then up at her. Even through the ice caked in his beard, she saw his mouth come open on something that was not quite a word. He turned back to the others and gestured hard at the ground. They came faster after that. Winifred pulled the torch inside and jammed the burning end into a mound of wet sand at the base of the wall, smothering it in one motion. The last of the kerosene hissed and died, smoke curled up and vanished. She dropped the hickory shaft and went to the covering with both hands ready. The first traveler reached the entrance and stopped breathing so hard he could not speak. I was older than she had guessed from the ridge near 60, his gray beard gone completely white with rime ice, his eyes the pale washed-out blue of long weathering. His lips barely moved, and when they did, the word came out cracked. "Please." She lifted the corner of the canvas and began pulling the packed grass out of the left-hand gap. "Come." Just that. Nobody asked permission twice. They came through one at a time, squeezing sideways through the narrow opening she had made, collapsing onto the sandstone floor before she could even guide them toward the back. The older man first, then a woman close to his own age with her hood pulled tight around her face. Then two younger men brothers, by the look of them, one considerably taller than the other. The small figure came fifth half, carried by the taller of the two brothers, and Winifred caught sight of a girl no more than 15, her lashes crusted with ice, her mouth pressed into a thin white line. Last through was a young man in a heavy sheepskin coat whose left arm hung against his side, in a way Winifred recognized on sight. She packed the grass back into the opening the moment he was clear and pressed the canvas flat over it. The roar of the storm dropped by half. Inside the hollow, the sound of 8 sets of exhausted lungs took its place, filling the small space with a wet warmth she could feel against her face. For a long time, nobody spoke at all. The travelers slumped where they had fallen, eyes closed, chests heaving. The older woman was the first to open her eyes and look around at the space. The packed grass wall, the wagon plank, the frozen canvas overhead, the still shape of the mule at the back of the hollow. Then her eyes settled on Winifred. She said nothing. She only reached out one gloved hand and touched Winifred's forearm, a light, brief pressure that carried the weight of something no words were going to improve on. The older man finally lifted his head and pulled the frozen scarf away from his mouth. "Wendell Prewitt." The introduction came out rough as gravel. "That's my wife, Drusilla." He tipped his chin toward the older woman. "These two here are brothers, Ransom and Lucian Cutler, hauling freight south out of Sheridan." The taller one nodded once without speaking. The younger one did not lift his head. "The girl belongs to Ransom. Elsie's her name. 15 years old and better than any of us on horseback in fair weather." Wendell's voice broke slightly on the word fair, and he cleared his throat. "And that fellow with the arm is Rufus Hollingsworth. He rode out of Sheridan with us because he was going down to see his mother in Casper." Winifred looked at each of them as he named them and gave her own name in return and nothing more. She did not have the wind for a story just then. Neither did they. Ransom Cutler spoke, his voice rasped nearly to nothing. "There were 25 wagons when we pulled out." His eyes stayed on the floor. 25, 3 days ago. Lucian beside him made a sound that might have been a word and might have been only breath, impressed the heels of both hands against his eyes. Winifred did not ask. She had been on the frontier long enough to know that when a man gives you a number in that particular tone, you do not go after the rest of it. Instead, she moved. She opened her food sack and took stock. 3 strips of dried venison, 1 small round of hard cheese, half a loaf of biscuit gone stone hard, a tin of hardtack, the last of a paper twist of coarse salt. She divided all of it into 8 equal portions on the flat lid of her father's toolbox. Careful and slow, the way you divide something when the dividing is the only fairness available. Each portion looked pitifully small on the wood. She handed them out one at a time without ceremony. Rufus Hollingsworth tried to wave his away with his good hand, saying she ought to keep it for the girl. Winifred shook her head. "You'll need it before morning." He looked at her a moment, then took the food and nodded. Elsie ate her portion in 3 small bites and then looked up at Drusilla Prewitt with the wide, uncertain eyes of a child who has not yet decided whether she is allowed to ask for more. Drusilla broke her own biscuit in half without a word and pressed the larger piece into the girl's palm. Then closed Elsie's fingers over it and held them there. Winifred watched that from across the hollow, and something moved in her chest that she could not name. She had never had a child. There had been talk of it in the first years with Elias, and then Elias had taken sick the first winter of their marriage, with something that took months to heal. And by the time they were both well again, a certain quietness had come into their bedroom that neither of them ever found the words for. Watching Drusilla close that girl's hand over half a biscuit felt like standing in a hallway looking into a room she had walked past for 8 years without going in. She turned to Rufus. "May I see the arm?" Han hesitated, then nodded and let her ease his coat back off the shoulder. The shirt underneath was soaked with sweat, already going cold. The shoulder itself was swollen, and the shape of it was wrong, in a way that made her breath catch the round of the joint gone flat. A hard knot pushed forward under the collarbone. Out of the socket and out for hours, most of the day by the color of the skin. She had seen exactly this once on a hired hand at the trading post who fell off a loading platform in the summer of 1877. Her father had been visiting that week and had set the joint himself in under a minute, with the hired man hollering loud enough to be heard 3 streets over. She had stood 4 feet away and watched him do it. She remembered every step because Barnaby Thorogood narrated everything he did with his hands always to anybody standing near enough to hear. "You've had it out a long while," she told Rufus quietly. "It's going to hurt worse going back than it did coming out." He met her eyes and said nothing for a beat. "Do it. Just do it." She looked across the hollow. "Mr. Pruitt, I need him held steady from behind." Wendell came without a word and knelt behind Rufus on the sand. Both large hands closed over the uninjured shoulder and across the young man's chest. Winifred braced her own boot against Rufus's ribs, took hold of his wrist and forearm, and pulled slow and steady, and without any jerk in it at all, turning the arm outward as she pulled, giving the joint time to find its own way home. Rufus made a sound between a groan and a laugh, and then the shoulder went back into the socket with a soft, wet pop that Winifred felt through both hands more than she heard. His whole body sagged forward into Wendell's grip. For a long moment, he simply breathed with his forehead against his own good hand. Then he lifted his head. "Better." The word came out thin but honest. "Better." She bound the arm against his ribs with a strip torn from her own petticoat, tight enough to keep the joint from working loose enough to let him breathe, and helped him get his coat back over the wrapping. When it was done, she sat back on her heels and looked down at her own hands, which had begun shaking now that the moment was past. She pressed them flat against her thighs until they stopped. Wendell Pruitt watched her do that and said nothing. But when she looked up, his eyes had changed. There was something in them that had not been there when he crawled through the gap in her wall. A specific kind of attention. The kind a man gives a piece of work when he has spent his whole life doing work of that kind and has just seen someone else do it right. Time began to lose its shape after that. Nobody had a watch that still ran. The light through the small gaps went from gray to nothing at all, and the wind outside settled into a steady roar that no longer surged or fell, but held on one long, unbroken note. Every so often, somebody would stand and stamp their feet and sit back down. Every so often, the canteen went around each person, taking one small, careful swallow before passing it on. Nobody drank more than that. There was no telling how long any of them would still be in this hollow when the last of the water was gone. Then Wendell said the thing that Winifred had been waiting for somebody to say since the moment they came through the wall. "We ought to have a fire." He said it easily, the way a man says a thing he has never once had cause to doubt. "Small one. Back in that corner there where the rock draws up. I've got a candle stub, and there's that hickory bow you burned, plus your driver's box up on the ridge if it comes to it. Enough for 4 or 5 hours. He rubbed his beard. "Take the edge off. That girl's shaking herself to pieces." I was not wrong about Elsie. She had begun trembling 20 minutes earlier in fine waves that ran up and down her small body and would not stop. And Wendell Pruitt was not a fool. He had been putting up outbuildings and line shacks and horse sheds in that country for 40 years. There was not a man within 100 miles better qualified to say what a shelter needed. Every face in that hollow turned toward Winifred. "No," she said. Wendell's eyebrows went up. Not angry. Surprised, and then a beat later patient, in the way of a man preparing to explain something obvious to somebody who has had a hard day. "Ma'am, how much air is in this room?" He stopped. "You built sheds 40 years, she said. In every one of them, there was a door with a gap under it and a roof with a gap at the eave, and chinking that had dried out and cracked in 3 places you never got around to. That's why you could burn a fire in them. The air you burned came back in through all the places you never sealed." She put her hand flat on the packed grass beside her. "I sealed this. I spent 90 minutes sealing it, and I checked every inch of it with the back of my hand. There is no gap. There is nothing coming in." Nobody moved. "A fire eats air," she said. "It eats it faster than 8 people in a mule do. When it's eaten enough, we start feeling sick and stupid, and none of us will know why. And the first thing anybody will think to do is open the wall to get more. She looked at Wendell. And the moment we open that wall in this wind, we lose the heat and the fire and probably the canvas. And then we're 8 people in a stone box at 30 below with no shelter and no fuel and nothing left to burn. The wind pushed against the wagon bed and let it go. My father put it plainer than I can, she said. He said the wind steals heat faster than any fire in a place like this can replace it. So you don't try to make heat here. You keep what you already carry and you add to it slow. She nodded at the back of the hollow. Bodies, the animal, breath. That's the fire. That's all the fire we're going to have, and it's already lit. Wendell Prewitt sat back on his heels. I was quiet for a good while. Then he said, I've killed men. Drusilla put her hand on his arm. Not with a gun. He was looking at the stone floor. 18 and 72, I put up a line shack on the Niobrara for an outfit out of Valentine. Good tight little building. Best chinking I ever laid. 2 hands wintered in it, and come January, somebody found them both dead of the cold, with a fireplace full of ash and the door standing open. He shook his head slowly. I always figured they'd gone out for wood and got turned around. I looked up at her. 40 years I've been telling myself that. Nobody said anything. The 8 of them sat in the dark, and the mule breathed, and the storm went on, grinding its teeth against the sandstone. And slowly, so slowly that nobody could say when it happened, the air in that hollow warmed. Not warm, never that. Bearable. Winifred noticed that her fingers, which had been half numb since she finished packing the wall, had regained enough feeling to hurt again. That was good. Pain was better than absence. The trouble arrived about 2 hours after that, and it did not announce itself either. Elsie started coughing. It was a small, dry cough at first, the kind anybody makes in cold air, and Winifred did not think anything of it. Then it came again and again, and then the girl was coughing in a hard-racking string that doubled her over with her forehead nearly on her knees, and Ransom Cutler had a hand on his daughter's back, and a look on his face that Winifred had seen exactly once before, in a mirror in February, in a loft above a store in Miles City. She got the lantern and turned the wick up, and in that yellow light she saw it. The air of the hollow was full of dust. Fine pale sand hanging in the lamplight in a slow drifting haze, thick enough to see as a solid thing. It moved when anybody moved. It swirled around the lantern chimney in visible currents. The floor of that hollow was packed sand, dry as flour, dry as it had been since the last rain of September. And 8 people and an 800-pound mule had been shifting and stamping and sitting down and standing up on it for 2 hours in a sealed room with no air coming in and none going out. Every scuff had lifted more of it. Nothing had carried any of it away. They had been breathing it the entire time. Winifred understood the whole shape of it in about 4 seconds, and the understanding had a sick weight to it because it was hers. Not the storms, not bad luck. She had sealed this room herself. She had made it airtight with her own hands and been proud of it, and airtight meant that whatever went into this air stayed in it. She had built a room that could not clean itself. She looked at Elsie coughing into her father's coat. Then she looked at the canteen on the stone by the wall. There was perhaps 2/3 of a quart of water in it. It was the only water in the hollow. 8 people had been passing it around one careful swallow at a time for hours, precisely because there might be another full day in this rock before anybody could move, and a person can go 3 days without water, but they will be useless after one. 2/3 of a quart divided 8 ways was the difference between a hard night and a very bad one. Winifred picked up the canteen and unstoppered it. Ransom Cutler saw her do it and half rose. Ma'am. She knelt down and began pouring the water onto the floor. Somebody said her name. Wendell said something sharp. She did not stop. She moved backward on her knees across the hollow in a slow arc, laying the water out in a thin ribbon over the packed sand from the back wall where the mule stood forward along the path where everyone had been walking out to the base of the wagon bed. She used every drop but a swallow. The sand went dark where the water touched it. The smell of wet earth came up into that stone room, an absurd smell, a springtime smell in the middle of the worst night of that winter. Then she took her boot and scuffed the wet sand across the dry, working it in until the whole floor of the hollow had gone from pale to brown. She sat back on her heels. Nobody said a word. Within a minute, the haze in the lantern light began to thin. Within 5, it was gone. Elsie's coughing slowed and then stopped, and the girl lay back against Drusilla Prewitt's shoulder with her eyes closed and her chest moving evenly. Winifred set the almost empty canteen back against the stone. We'll be thirsty by noon tomorrow, she said. That's a thing we can be. There's snow on the other side of that wall, and we can melt it in a tin against a body once the wind lays down enough to open the wall for 30 seconds. She looked around at all of them in the lamplight. There's no place at all to put that dust except our lungs. That's not a thing we can be. Wendell Prewitt let out a long breath. Ma'am, he said, I have built shelters for 40 years, and I never once in my life thought about the floor. Winifred turned the lantern back down to a bare thread of flame. Neither did I, she said, until she coughed. Some while later, she could not have said how long, only that the storm had changed pitch once, and the cold had gone through another notch. Lucian Cutler stirred from where he had been half lying against his brother's shoulder. He looked over at her with red-rimmed eyes. Ma'am, can I ask you something? She nodded. Ransom said your name is Ashcroft. He worked his jaw a moment. Would you be any relation to Elias Ashcroft out of Miles City? She felt her breath go still in her chest. How was my husband? She said. He passed last February. Lucian looked at the sandstone floor for a long moment. Then he looked up and there was something in his face she did not immediately understand. My brother and I worked a summer at your husband's post. 6 years back now. I was 17. He wiped his nose with the back of his wrist. Elias took me on to load freight even though I was skinny as a rail and no good for much of anything at first. He paid us fair. He was decent to me. Lucian's voice thickened, then steadied. He was the first man I ever worked for who acted like I was worth something. I wanted you to know it. Seemed like the right time to say so. Winifred pressed a hand against her mouth. Elias had never mentioned the Cutler brothers by name, but he had hired dozens of young hands over the years and had never let one go that she could remember for anything short of drunkenness. Thank you, she managed. Thank you, Lucian. That's worth more than you know. Ransom reached over and gripped his brother's shoulder. And Lucian, because he was young and tired, and because the dead man had been kind to him, once kept talking. How was good to us all that summer, he said. Only time I ever saw him low was in August. There was a fellow come out from back east and stopped at the post twice inside 2 weeks. Wore a black coat in August, which I remember because I thought it was a fool thing to do in that heat. Second time he come, they went out back of the smokehouse, and I heard your husband's voice go up, which I never heard before or after. I looked at her. When the fellow rode off, Mr. Ashcroft come and found me stacking crates, and he says, Lucian, don't mention that man to my wife. That was all he said. He never brought it up again, and neither did I. Lucian's face changed as he watched hers. I always figured it was some drummer trying to sell him something he couldn't afford. Was I wrong to say it? Winifred did not answer for a long moment. August of 1878. She had signed the release of dower in April of 1881. Which meant that a man in a black wool coat had been standing behind her husband's smokehouse 2 years and 8 months before Elias ever laid that paper down beside the flour scale, and that Elias had known in August of 1878 that he did not want his wife to know the man's name. She had spent 30 days last month believing she had married a man who got in over his head and drowned quietly rather than frighten her. She was now sitting in a hole in a rock in a blizzard, understanding that it had taken him 6 years to drown. 6 years of a man coming through that door in a black coat, and Elias smiling at her across the counter afterward, and the two of them eating supper at the scrub pine table, where every one of those papers would eventually be laid out one at a time. No, she said at last, and her voice came out level, which surprised her. You weren't wrong to say it. The wind pressed the wall inward and let it go. Did the man have a name? Lucian shook his head slowly. Never heard it. That's all right, Winifred said. I have it. She sat awake a long while after that. Elsie had gone to sleep against Drusilla with her head tipped sideways, and the older woman had put an arm around her, without seeming to notice she had done it. Rufus dozed against the far wall with his bound arm cradled. Ransom and Lucian slept back to back. Wendell sat upright against the stone with his chin on his chest, breathing slow. The mule stood over all of them with her head down half asleep, adding what she had. Winifred took out her father's letter and read the second page, and then the third by a lantern turned down to almost nothing. Barnaby wrote about his own father, a Vermont farmer who had lost 3 children to diphtheria in the winter of 1832, and never afterward spoke any of their names aloud. He wrote about the death of Winifred's mother in Sandusky and the guilt he had carried west because he had not been home when the cholera came through. And then near the bottom of the third page he wrote about Elias. He's a good man with a soft heart and a poor head for money, and I have watched him carry paper from Cheyenne for 2 years now and say nothing to you about it. I said nothing myself because I told myself it was not my place. That was cowardice dressed up as respect. Forgive me for it. If it has come apart by the time you read this, do not spend a single hour hating him. Hate is heavy, and you will be carrying enough. He did not do it to you. He did it around you, which is worse because it means he thought you could not have borne it, and he was wrong, and he never lived to find out how wrong. Winifred read that paragraph 4 times. Then she folded the letter along its creases and put it back inside her coat against her ribs. She did not cry. She had promised herself she would not on account of the cold, and because Barnaby Thorogood had never in his life been the kind of man who wanted anybody weeping over his handwriting. But something inside her chest that had been locked shut since the previous February began to work loose one careful notch at a time. Near what she guessed was midnight, the wind changed. Not weaker. Different. Like a musician moving to a lower key. Winifred had been half dozing against the sandstone with Elsie's head on her shoulder, and she came fully awake in an instant. She did not move. She only listened. The roar was still there, but underneath it, she could hear individual gusts, now distinct from the constant howl, each one striking the bluff and then falling away with quiet in between them that got a little longer each time. She knew that sound. She had heard it once before in the fall of 1876 on a freight run down the Belfourche, when her father made an entire outfit sit 2 more hours in a cut bank, while every man in the party stood up and told him the sky was clearing and they were burning daylight. Barnaby Thorogood had sat on a rock with his hat in his hands and let them talk. And then the second wave had come down out of the north and taken the top off the ridge above them, and not one of those men ever argued with him again. The first quiet in a Wyoming storm is almost always a lie. She said nothing to anybody. Around her 7 people slept in a stone room that was 30 degrees warmer than the country outside it. On a floor she had soaked with the last of their water behind a wall she had dragged 400 yards down a frozen ridge. Winifred Ashcroft sat with her back against sandstone that had stood there since before her country had a name, and she watched the seam of the canvas, and she waited. She sat awake through the rest of it. Nobody else did. Rufus surfaced twice and went under again. Elsie never moved at all, and Winifred sat with her back against the stone through what she later worked out to be 4.5 hours, listening to a storm let go of a country one handhold at a time. Sometime in the gray of what had to be morning, Thistle lifted her head. The mule stood up all the way, ears forward, nostrils working, and then walked unbidden across the damp sand of the hollow and stopped a foot from the covering. She did not paw at it. She simply stood there, calm breathing, evenly facing the wall, the way an animal faces a door it expects to open. Winifred watched her for a long moment. An animal notices an ending as reliably as it notices a beginning. Her father had told her that on a wagon seat outside Rapid City, in a voice as sure as bedrock, and she had believed it then, and she believed it now. And between the mule and the wind, she was as certain as she was going to get. But she gave it another hour anyway. She counted that hour not by any clock, but by the way the light through the small gap changed from pewter to pale bone, and by the way her own breath began to show as smaller, paler clouds in front of her face. When she judged the storm had spent itself for good, she rose and began the careful work of taking apart the wall she had built with such desperate hands the afternoon before. The packed grass came out in stiff, frozen wads that broke apart in her fingers. She handed each clump to Wendell, who piled it against the back wall of the hollow, rather than throwing it away. Because a wall built once can be built again if the sky turns on you a second time. Neither of them said that out loud. Neither of them had to. The canvas was harder. It had frozen to the sandstone in a solid sheet, and she had to pry it loose with the flat end of her father's chisel, working slowly so as not to tear it. The wagon plank came last. Wendell took one end, and she took the other, and together they tipped it sideways out of the opening and let it drop into the deep drift that had piled against the entrance in the night. Cold flooded in, not the killing cold of the storm, but the clean, sharp cold of a Wyoming morning after weather has passed. Winifred stepped out through the opening for the first time in almost 15 hours. Her boots went into the knee. She stood there a long moment looking out. The prairie had been rewritten. What had been open grassland the afternoon before was now a rolling white sea broken only by the tops of the tallest sage and by the sandstone bluffs rising above the drifts like the shoulders of half-buried giants. The sky above was a hard, perfect blue, so bright after the darkness that she had to shade her eyes with her hand. The sun sat low in the east and threw long blue shadows across the snow. It was without any argument the most beautiful morning she had ever seen in her life. She heard the others coming out behind her. Wendell first, then Drusilla, then Ransom leading Elsie by the hand. Rufus followed, moving stiff-legged with his bound arm against his ribs, and Lucian came last with one hand steadying his brother's back. Nobody spoke. They only stood in a rough line at the mouth of the hollow, looking at what the night had made of the world. Then Winifred turned her head slowly toward the northern rise where the ridge trail ran. Even at that distance, she could see them. Dark shapes scattered across all that whiteness, half buried, some tipped on their sides, some still upright, but leaning. Wagons not one or two but many strung along the high ground for the better part of a mile, with the low humps of pack animals beside a few of them. She counted 11 before she stopped counting and made herself look away. Wendell's voice came out very quiet behind her. 25. Ransom Cutler did not answer him. He put both hands over his daughter's eyes and turned her by the shoulders until she was facing south. Drusilla stepped forward and put an arm around Winifred's shoulders. The older woman's grip was firm, the grip of somebody who understood exactly what Winifred was feeling and who had already learned that there is nothing whatsoever to say about it. Some of them made shelter of their own, Drusilla said at last. We can't know from here. We only know what we can see. She squeezed once and let her hand fall. Come, we need to move before we all seize up. They packed what little they had into a single bundle. Winifred wrapped her father's tools in the oilcloth and lashed the toolbox onto Thistle's back with harness. She cut down from the wagon rigging, and the mule stood patient while she worked ears forward, watching the doorway of the shelter as if committing it to memory. Winifred paused with one hand on the mule's neck and looked back at the hollow herself. The three original walls stood as they had stood for centuries. The place where her single added wall had been now gaped open again, unremarkable, indistinguishable from any other shadow in the sandstone. In a week, the snow would fill it. In a season, the wind would work the mark smooth. In a year, there would be nothing at all to show that 8 people and 1 mule had passed a night here. She did not need the world to know. She only needed the hollow to have done what it had done, which was hold. They set off south along what Winifred judged to be the general line of the trail, though the trail itself was invisible under the drifts. Wendell broke path in front, with the hickory bough she had used for a torch testing the snow ahead of each step. Ransom came behind him with Elsie between himself and Lucian. Rufus walked next. Drusilla and Winifred brought up the rear with Thistle plodding between them, punching neat round holes through the crust. 3 miles south of the bluff, they saw the riders. 2 men on horseback moving slowly, one of them leading a string of pack mules loaded with blankets and coffee sacks and small barrels of salt pork. A relief party out of Buffalo sent north the moment the sky had cleared enough to saddle a horse. The lead rider saw them and put his heels to his mount, and even at that distance, Winifred heard the man shout with something like disbelief in his voice. They met on a low rise where the wind had scoured the snow thin enough to walk on grass again. The lead rider was a big-shouldered man of maybe 45 with a weathered face, and his eyes widened as he counted their party. He was the deputy out of Johnson County, and his name was Ezekiel Bardwell. And when Ransom told him that all 8 of them had sheltered together through the night in a rock hollow half a day's walk north, Bardwell took his hat off and simply stared at them. 19, he said after a long silence. The word came out flat. We found 19 this morning along the north stretch from the last ranch up to the Bighorn Cutoff. He put his hat back on. Now we know 8 of you are alive. That makes it better than we thought. He looked at Winifred, whose posture had drawn his eye from the moment he rode up, and something in his face shifted. Ma'am, I don't know who you are, but whatever you did up there, we'd like to hear about it once you're warm. Winifred was not looking at him. She was looking northwest. There was a line along the top of the Bighorns that had not been there 20 minutes earlier, a thin gray shelf lying flat against the sky above the peaks, so low and so pale it might have been a trick of the morning light. The air had gone still again, not the ordinary stillness of a cold morning. That other stillness, the one she had felt on the ridge yesterday afternoon with a mule that would not move. She turned around. Thistle had stopped walking. The mule stood in the trampled snow 20 feet behind the party, with her head up and her ears flat back against her skull facing northwest, and she was not moving one hoof. Winifred's whole body went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. It's not over, she said. Bardwell looked at her. Ma'am, there's another one coming, 3 hours, maybe less. The deputy's eyes went to the sky. It was at that moment the clearest blue that country had produced in 3 weeks. Not a cloud anywhere a man could see from horseback on a low rise. With respect, he said carefully, you've had a hard night. My father sat an outfit down on the Belforche in '76 for 2 hours in weather exactly like this, while 8 men told him he was wasting daylight, she said. The second wave took the top off the ridge above where we were sitting. The first quiet in a storm out of the north is almost always a lie. She pointed at the gray shelf on the mountains. That's not haze, it's the same cloud. It went around behind the range and it's coming back over. Bardwell squinted at it for a long moment, and she watched him decide. That's 10 miles off if it's anything, he said. We're 4 hours from Buffalo with this snow. I've got 2 men, 12 animals, and 8 people on foot, one of them a girl and one with a bad arm. There are survivors on the north stretch. We walked that stretch this morning. We found 19 dead. You found 19 dead in the wagons, Winifred said. How many of those wagons were empty when you got to them? Bardwell did not answer. He did not answer because the answer was 4, and because he had been telling himself since sunup that those 4 wagons had been abandoned by people who made it out. They went to ground, Winifred said. The same as we did. Cutbank deadfall under a wagon box. They've been in the open all night with no food and no fire, and this morning they saw the sun come out, and they started walking south because that's what a person does when the sky clears. She looked at him steadily. They are strung out on foot between here and the cutoff right now, and in 3 hours it is going to come down on them in open country. The deputy ran a hand down his face. If you're wrong, I've killed my own animals for nothing and put my party in the open. Then don't take your party. She was already unlashing the toolbox from Thistle's back. Take these people south, all of them. That's what you rode out here to do, and you should do it. Ma'am, I'll go. Wendell Prewitt said her name. She turned around, and he was standing there in the snow, with his beard still white with ice, and his hands half raised, and she saw exactly what he was about to offer. No, she said, I'm going with you. You are 60 years old, and you spent last night on a stone floor at 30 below. She said it flatly without any softening in it at all, because there was no time to be gentle, and because gentleness would have made it an argument. You'd slow me by half, and I'd have to make the decision twice, once for the ones out there, and once for you. I can't carry that. Take your wife to Buffalo. Drusilla put a hand on her husband's arm. Wendell looked at Winifred for a long moment. Then he did something nobody expected. He unbuttoned his own coat, pulled out the folding knife he had carried for 30 years, and put it into her hand. Then take a better blade than that chisel, he said. And ma'am, he stopped. His jaw worked. Cut in on the lee side, always the lee. Don't let a bank stand over you where it can slough. I know you know. He closed her fingers around the knife the way Drusilla had closed Elsie's around the biscuit. I'm saying it because I've got nothing else to give you. Bardwell gave her a horse. I did it without a word, dismounting and handing her the reins of his own animal, a heavy-boned bay that had broken trail all morning. And then he stripped his saddle blanket off and gave her that too, and one of the salt pork barrels and a coil of picket rope. North stretch is 9 miles, he said. You'll be in the worst of it coming back. I won't be coming back. I looked at her. Not until it lays down, she said. That's the whole point. Elsie Cutler broke out of her father's grip and ran 3 steps through the snow and put her arms around Winifred's waist and held on. Winifred stood there with a horse's reins in one hand and a man's knife in the other and let the girl hold her, and did not say anything at all because she had discovered somewhere in the last 15 hours that she had no words for children and never would. Then she got up into the saddle, took Thistle's lead, and turned north. She found them at the 11th mile. By then the gray shelf had come off the mountains and spread across a third of the sky, and the light had gone from blue to a flat silver, and the temperature had begun to drop in a way she could feel in the roof of her mouth. She had passed 3 of the empty wagons by then. She had not stopped at them. She had ridden the low ground where a walking party would go working the draws, and she had found their track at the 9th mile, a broken line of post holes through untouched snow, heading south and east and wandering badly. She came up on them a half-mile later. There were 4. A man of about 35 on his feet, but not well, with frostbite, gone black on 3 fingers of his right hand. 2 children, a boy of maybe 8 and a girl of 5 or 6, the boy walking, the girl being carried. And an older woman, the man's mother by the look of her, who had sat down in the snow 20 yards back and told them to go on, and who had been sitting there for perhaps 10 minutes when Winifred came over the rise. That was what Winifred saw first, the woman sitting down. She put the horse into the drift at a heavy plunging trot and got there and swung off and hauled the old woman up under the arms before she could say a word about it. And the woman was crying and apologizing, and Winifred said nothing at all and put her across the bay's withers and lashed the picket rope over her thighs to hold her there. Then she rode up to the man. There's another storm, she said. 90 minutes, maybe less. He looked at the sky and then at her, and she watched him understand it, and she watched something go out of his face. We can't make 9 miles, he said. No, there's nothing out here. Winifred was already turning in the saddle, looking east, then north, then east again, reading the ground the way her father had taught her to read it on a summer afternoon on the road to Fort Laramie, which was not the same as reading it for shelter, because he had been reading it for a place he already knew existed. There was no sandstone bluff here. This was open, flat country between the trail and the river sage and grass and nothing. But there was a creek. She could see the line of it, a quarter-mile east, a shallow, crooked seam through the snow where the ground fell away, willows growing along it, the whole thing invisible from any distance, except this one. And on the far side of that creek, where the water had cut for a few thousand years into rising ground, there would be a bank. "Follow me," she said. The cut bank was 6 feet high, and it ran 40 yards along the outside of the creek's bend, and it faced south-southeast. And Winifred sat her horse in front of it for perhaps 8 seconds and saw the entire thing whole. The hollow at the bluff had been given to her. 3 walls and a roof already there, waiting since before the Republic. This was nothing. This was a dirt bank. But it was frozen clay with a hard cap, and it was already one wall, and the 2 arms of the bend curled forward at either end, where the water had scoured deepest, and if she cut into it. "Get them down," she said. "All of them. Under the lip, right against the bank, and keep them there." She unlashed the old woman and got her onto the ground and put the 2 children in against the clay with the saddle blanket around them. Then she took her father's spade off Thistle's back and began to dig. She cut into the bank at the deepest part of the bend, where the frozen cap was thickest and least likely to slough, and she cut in rather than down, driving the spade horizontally into the clay at chest height and working the face back a foot at a time. The top 8 inches were like iron, and she had to break them with the pick before the spade would take. Beneath that, the clay was cold, but workable gray and dense, and cutting away in slabs. The man came and stood beside her with his blackened hand held against his chest. "Tell me what to do." "Willows," she said without stopping. "Green ones off the creek. Cut them long as you can. Then all the dead grass you can pull out of the drift along that bar, the tall stuff roots and all. Bring it in armfuls and pile it here." I went. She dug for 40 minutes, and the sky came down to meet her while she did it. By the time she had cut a hollow 4 feet deep and 6 wide and 5 high, 3 walls of frozen clay, and a floor of the same, the roof being the underside of the frozen cap itself, which she left a full 18 inches thick because she was not fool enough to trust anything thinner. The light had gone from silver to the color of dishwater, and the first ribbons of loose snow had begun hissing east across the flat. The first snow never attacks, it only measures. She climbed out and looked at what she had. An open mouth 6 feet wide in the side of a dirt bank. The 4th wall was still missing. It was always going to be the 4th wall. There was no wagon here. Winifred stood in the rising wind with a spade in her hand and looked at the boy, 8 years old, standing in the snow, holding an armful of dead grass nearly as big as he was, and at the girl under the blanket, and at the old woman, and at the man with 3 dead fingers. And then she looked at the willows. The man had cut 11 of them green and whippy and 6 feet long. She put them across the mouth of the cut, vertically butt ends driven down into the frozen creek gravel tops leaned back against the lip of the bank, a rough palisade with a hand's width between each stem. Then she wove the smaller withes through them crosswise in and out, over and under, pulling each one tight against the last. The way you weave rushes into the seat of a chair. She had done it once in a lifetime before yesterday. She had now done it twice in 18 hours, and her hands knew it. Then came the grass. She packed it into the willow lattice in handfuls, working it in sideways, crossing the stems layer against layer, until the weave went from something you could see through to something you could not. Then snow. That was the last piece, and it was the piece the hollow at the bluff had never needed. She shoveled snow against the outside of the grass wall and packed it with the flat of the spade a foot thick, then 18 inches, building it up the whole height of the opening, because a snowbank is not cold. A snowbank is a wall full of trapped still air, and trapped still air is the warmest thing in the world when there is nothing else to be had. She left a gap 11 inches wide at the top of the wall at the very peak on the downwind end, and she did not seal it. She had learned that lesson at 8 o'clock the previous evening from a 15-year-old girl coughing into her father's coat, and she was never going to build a sealed room again as long as she lived. The last thing she did was walk out 10 yards and drive the hickory bow upright into the drift with a strip of white petticoat tied to the top, so that anybody riding this ground in 3 days would know that the bank had been cut into. Then she pulled the horse and the mule in behind the willow wall on the lee end, and she crawled in after them and she pushed a last armful of grass into the gap behind her. The second wave hit 11 minutes later. It came down out of the northwest, exactly the way the first one had, except that this time there was nobody left on that prairie who had not either found a hole or stopped needing one. Inside the cut, 5 people and 2 animals sat in the dark with their backs against frozen clay while the wind screamed along the creek and drove snow against a wall of willow and grass and packed powder. The wall bowed inward and held. The little girl fell asleep within the hour, which is the thing children do that adults never can. The boy stayed awake and asked Winifred at some point in the middle of it how she had known where to dig. "I didn't," she said. "I knew what to look for." "That's different." "Who taught you?" She thought about it for a while. "My father showed me a hole in a rock when I was 15 years old," she said. "He never told me what to do with it. I've been finding that out since yesterday afternoon." The second storm blew itself out before dawn, having lasted 9 hours instead of 15, and it took 2 more days for the county to break trail far enough north to reach them. When Ezekiel Bardwell finally came up that creek on the second morning with 4 men and 6 fresh horses, what he found was a strip of white cloth on a stick and a wall of woven willow packed with snow and 5 people alive behind it who had eaten the last of a small barrel of salt pork the night before and were all things considered in reasonable order. High sat his horse and looked at that wall for a long time before he got down. The third of the empty wagons had belonged to a family named Coffey out of Sheridan. The man's name was Absalom Coffey, and the children were Ned and June, and the older woman was his mother. Philadelphia and Absalom Coffey lost 2 fingers on his right hand in Buffalo 3 days later and kept the third. 19 people died on that trail in the storm of November 1884. Because of a mule that would not walk on a clear morning and a cut bank on a nameless creek, the number stopped at 19 instead of going on to 23. That was the whole of the arithmetic. Winifred Ashcroft never once spoke it aloud in her life and thought about it nearly every day. Buffalo, when she finally came into it, sat in the shallow bowl of a valley on the eastern edge of the Bighorns with its false-fronted buildings, dark against the white hills, and smoke rising from every chimney in the settlement. Word of what had happened on the North Trail had reached town 2 days ahead of her. There were people along the main street when the relief party came in, and Winifred felt every one of them looking, and she did not meet a single set of eyes because she was looking for one face only. She found it in front of the second building past the courthouse. A tall man in his middle 50s, gray at the temples, wearing a wool coat that had seen better winters, standing with his hat in both hands and his shoulders set square the way he had always stood when he was trying to hold himself together. Ephraim Thorogood saw her before she quite saw him, and he came through that crowd faster than a man his age had any business moving. And when he reached her, he did not say anything at all. He simply put his arms around his sister and held on. "Winnie," he said at last against her hair. "Winnie, girl, Pa said you'd come." She had not cried through the storm. She had not cried reading the letter or setting Rufus Hollingsworth's shoulder or pouring the last of the water onto the floor or digging into a cut bank with 90 minutes of light left or walking south past the wagons on the ridge. She cried now with her forehead pressed into her brother's shoulder in the middle of the street with the whole town of Buffalo watching. Ephraim did not let go until she was ready. She slept 14 hours in a real bed. She woke near noon the following day to the smell of coffee and found her brother in the parlor with a Cheyenne newspaper open on his lap. And he looked up and his face broke into the same slow, careful smile their father had used. "There she is," he said. "Sit, eat something. We'll talk when you're ready." She ate bacon and eggs and biscuits with molasses and coffee strong enough to strip paint. And then she talked. She told him all of it, the axle, the hollow, the wagon bed, the 6 on the ridge, the torch and the mirror, Rufus's arm, the dust, the water, the cut bank, the willow wall. And then she told him about Cornelius Vantrees and about a Monday morning in April of 1881 with flour on her hands. Ephraim set his coffee down very slowly. "You signed a release of dower." "I signed 4 sheets without reading one of them." "Winnie," he leaned forward, "half the married women in this territory have signed one of those. Their husbands hand it to them across a supper table and say, 'Bank wants this,' and they sign it. That's how it's done. That's how it's always been done. That's not a defense. That's a description of the problem." Her brother looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "There's a man in this town you need to talk to." Winifred shook her head. "There's a lawyer," Ephraim said, "and there's an editor, and there's a federal marshal up from Cheyenne who hasn't been able to leave because the storm closed the road south." "No," he stopped. "I don't want a lawyer to read my papers," she said. "I've read my papers. I read them for 30 nights. There's nothing in them a lawyer can use because Van Trees didn't do anything to me that isn't legal in every state and territory in this country. She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. I want to talk to Wendell Pruitt. The Pruitts had been taken in by the deputy's family 2 houses down from Ephraim's on Fetterman Street, and Winifred walked down there that same afternoon with her father's toolbox under her arm. Drusilla let her in. Wendell was sitting by the stove with his boots off and both feet in a basin of warm water, and when he saw her, he started to get up, and she waved him back down. "Mr. Pruitt," she said, "in the hollow you told me about a line shack on the Niobrara." His face went still. "You also told me you'd signed something in Nebraska, around 2 in the morning when nobody was guarding what they said." I had, and Winifred had been holding a girl's head on her shoulder at the time, and had said nothing about it then, and had not stopped thinking about it since. "My brother Enoch," Wendell said, 18 and 81, fellow came out to the place from a bank in Omaha, tied in with some Chicago house. Told Enoch he could double his money in 18 months if he'd put up his section on the North Loop. He rubbed his palm slowly across his beard. 18 months later, the loan called early on a clause he never understood. Land went. He took his own life that spring. You witnessed the signature. I did. Did you read it? Wendell Pruitt looked at the basin of water around his feet. "Ma'am," he said, "I have built 400 buildings in this country. I can lay a foundation, cut a rafter, hang a door, and tell you within a board how much lumber a job will take before I've drawn a line." I looked up. "I cannot read one word of English, not my own name. Drusilla's read me every letter I've had in 41 years. The room was quiet. "He read it to me," Wendell said. "The fellow from the bank, read the whole of it out loud sitting at Enoch's table, and he read it slow and clear, and he answered every question we put to him. That's why I put my mark on it, because he read it out loud to 2 men who couldn't." Winifred sat down in the chair across from him. "Describe him." Wendell shrugged. 40 or so, narrow through the shoulders, never raised his voice the whole afternoon, not once, not even when Enoch got hot about the interest. "What was he wearing?" "A black wool coat." He said it without any particular weight because he did not know yet that it mattered. "In November," which is sensible enough, but Enoch remarked on it after because the man never took it off. "Sat 2 hours at that table in his coat and his hat, both like a fellow who might leave any minute." He shook his head. "And then when he did leave, he stopped in the door and took the hat off and held it against his chest a second before he went out. I remember that because it struck me as a decent thing to do, and I thought better of him for it." Winifred set the papers down flat on her knee. "That's him," she said. "Ma'am, that's the man who sat in my kitchen last October." Drusilla stopped moving in the doorway. "He does the hat," Winifred said. "Every time. At the door on the way out after he's finished." Her voice had gone very quiet. "It's how he tells himself he's not what he is." Wendell Pruitt sat with his feet in a basin of cooling water and stared at her. "Mr. Pruitt," she said, "how good is your memory?" I blinked. "For things you've heard," she said. "Not read, heard." Drusilla answered from the doorway before her husband could. "He can tell you the price of every board he's bought since 1862, she said. "He never wrote one of them down. He never could." Winifred opened her father's toolbox and took out the folded stack of papers she had carried 400 yards down a frozen ridge and had never once considered leaving behind. "I'm going to read you a mortgage," she said. "Mine. All of it, every word, and it will take about an hour, and most of it will be tedious." She smoothed the top sheet. "I want you to tell me if any part of it sounds like a thing you've heard before." It took 90 minutes, not 60. Wendell Pruitt sat with his eyes closed and his head back and his hands flat on his thighs, and Winifred read the whole instrument aloud in a flat, steady voice. The recitals, the covenants, the schedule, the paragraph about insurance, the paragraph about taxes, the paragraph about the manner of notice. Twice he stopped her and had her go back, and both times he shook his head and told her to go on. At the 7th paragraph on the 4th page, he opened his eyes. She read it again. He asked her to read it a 3rd time. Then Wendell Pruitt sat up in his chair with his feet still in the basin and said, "He never read us that." Winifred did not move. "You're certain?" "Ma'am, I sat at my brother's table for 2 hours in November of 1881 and listened to a man read a paper out loud, and I have gone back over that afternoon in my head every week since Enoch died, which is 100 and some odd times." His voice had gone rough. "There was a paragraph about the taxes, and then he went straight on to the part about the notice. There was nothing in between. He never said one word about acceleration on a default of any covenant. Not one word. He might have used different language. He might have. He didn't." Wendell shook his head slowly. "I'd remember, because if I'd heard it, I'd have asked him what it meant. That's what a man does when he can't read. He asks. It's all he's got. Winifred looked down at the sheet on her knee. She had read this paragraph 40 times in October. She had read it by lamplight at a scrub pine table in Miles City, and she had understood what it did, and she had understood that there was nothing to be done about it, and she had turned the page. It was the paragraph that had taken her house. Default on any covenant, not merely non-payment, but any covenant at all, including the covenant to keep the improvements in good repair, accelerated the entire balance at the lender's sole election. Every note Vantrees wrote had it. He had to include it because it was the whole machine. Without it, he was a man waiting patiently for a farmer to miss a payment. With it, he could call a 160-acre note because a barn roof leaked. And he could not leave it out of the paper. But he could leave it out of his mouth. Mr. Prewitt, Winifred said slowly, how many men in Nebraska in 1881 couldn't read? Wendell looked at her. Half, he said. Better than half out on the loop. Bohemians, Germans, and a whole lot of plain Americans who never got past the third reader. He said it without shame, the way a man states weather. That's who he was selling to. Men with land and no letters. That's the whole trade. Winifred stood up and walked to the window. She was not a lawyer. She had never seen the inside of a courthouse. She did not know what a federal statute looked like, and she could not have told anybody the difference between fraud and misrepresentation if her life depended on it. But she had spent 30 consecutive nights teaching herself from nothing what one particular man's paperwork looked like. And there is a thing that happens when you read 40 documents by the same hand. You stop seeing sentences. You start seeing habits. Cornelius Vantrees used the same form in every state. He had to. The paper was the product. And a man who uses the same form in every state and who has learned that his form works best on people who cannot check it does not improvise a new omission at every table. He skips the same paragraph every time because it is the only paragraph he cannot afford them to ask about, and because after the fourth or fifth time, it stops being a decision and becomes the way he reads. He takes his hat off at the door too, every time, for the same reason. A habit leaves a track. That is the entire nature of a habit. How many other men did he sit with? She said to the window. Behind her, Wendell Prewitt said, in Nebraska, dozens. The federal marshal was a rangy, quiet man named Alpheus Quimby, and he had been stranded in Buffalo 11 days by the storm and was in a mood about it. He gave Winifred 20 minutes out of courtesy to her brother. He gave her 4 hours after the first 20. What she laid on the table in his room at the Occidental Hotel was not evidence, and she was careful about that because she did not want him thinking she believed it was. What she laid on the table was one mortgage instrument, one release of dower, and one 60-year-old man who could not read a word of either and who could recite without hesitation the exact sequence of paragraphs that had been read aloud to him in his brother's kitchen 37 months earlier. He'll say your man misremembers, Quimby said. He will. One witness can't read 3 years on. Yes. Against a man with a bank behind him. Yes, Winifred said, which is why you'll need more than one. Quimby leaned back. There are 200 of these notes, she said. Maybe more. Nebraska, Dakota, Wyoming, Kansas, Illinois. Every one written on the same form because I've now read 2 of them side by side, and the only differences are the names and the numbers. And a good many were signed by men who couldn't read them. She put her hand flat on the papers. Find 12 of those men. Sit each one down separately without the others in the room, and read him the whole instrument, and ask him where it doesn't match what he heard. Alpheus Quimby looked at her for a long moment. And if they all point at the same paragraph, then it isn't memory, Winifred said. It's a method. The marshal picked up the mortgage and turned to the 4th page and read the 7th paragraph twice. Then he said, ma'am, how long did you say you spent reading these? 30 nights. Why? She almost did not answer him. Because I signed one without reading it once, she said, and it cost me my house. I promised myself I'd never do it again. That's all it was. It wasn't cleverness. It was penance. Quimby set the paper down. That's the first honest reason anybody's given me for anything this year, he said and reached for his coat. They found 23 men. It took Alpheus Quimby and 2 deputy marshals 4 months and 1,100 miles of winter travel, and they interviewed each one alone in his own house, with no other witness present, and they read him the entire instrument from the beginning. 18 of the 23 could not read. 16 of the 18 stopped the marshal at the same paragraph and said in a dozen different accents across 5 states and territories some version of the same sentence. He never read us that. Cornelius Vantrees was arrested in Chicago in the 3rd week of March 1885 and tried in the federal court at Cheyenne beginning the 14th of April on 11 counts of using the mails to defraud. Winifred rode down from Buffalo with her brother and the Prewitts. She sat on a hard bench for the whole of the proceedings, wearing the black dress she had worn to Elias's funeral. She was not called. The government did not need her. Her own instrument had been read aloud to her by nobody, and she had signed the release with her eyes open on a scale full of flour, and that was not a crime that had been done to her. It was only a life. Wendell Prewitt was called on the third day. He sat in that box for 2 hours and 40 minutes with his big hands on his knees, and he did not read one word of anything. And he told a federal jury exactly what a man had said out loud at his brother's table in November of 1881, and exactly what that man had not said. When the defense attorney asked him how he could possibly be certain after so long, Wendell Prewitt looked at the man for a while before he answered. "Because I've had nothing else to do with it, sir," he said. "You gentlemen who read, you put a thing down on paper, and then you're shut of it. I can't do that. Everything I've got I have to carry." The jury was out 5 hours. The verdict came down on the 25th of April, guilty on 11 counts. Judge Presley Whitcomb sentenced Cornelius Vantrease to 12 years in the federal prison at Detroit in the Chicago house behind him, was fined heavily, and made to compensate a long list of people in 5 states and territories. Winifred met him once. It was in the corridor outside the courtroom on the last day, and there were people everywhere, and she had not sought it out, and neither had he. It was between 2 marshals, and she was standing against the wall waiting for her brother, and the crowd shifted and put them 4 feet apart. Cornelius Vantrease stopped. He looked at her, and he knew her, and after a moment he took off his hat and held it against his chest. Winifred Ashcroft looked at that hat for a second and a half. Then she looked up at his face. "That's how they caught you," she said. He did not understand her. She watched him not understand it, and she found that she did not particularly want to explain. "You did the same thing every time," she said. "At the door, on your way out, because it let you leave a house you just emptied and still think well of yourself in the morning." She let that sit for a beat. "You read those papers the same way, every time. The same words in the same silence in the same place until you weren't choosing anymore. You were just a man doing what he does." Vantrease's hand was still holding the hat against his coat. "You spent your whole life betting that nobody reads," Winifred said. "You were right about that. You were right about it for 6 years in my own kitchen." She stepped past him. "You were right until last October." The compensation draft reached Buffalo in September of 1885. It was enough to clear the balance still owed on the Miles City property and leave a working sum besides. She did not go back to Miles City. There was nothing there for her with Elias gone and the post belonging to somebody else. She bought the small house next to her brother's on Fetterman Street outright that winter. She kept Thistle in the stable behind it. She put her father's toolbox on a shelf in the front room above a small writing desk. And in the long evenings of that first Wyoming winter of her new life, she began to write down everything her father had taught her about weather and shelter and staying alive. It took 3 years. She was not a natural writer, and she rewrote every chapter at least twice. But she kept at it because the editor of the Buffalo paper had told her she ought to try, and because she had come to believe in the months after the trial that what Barnaby Thorogood knew did not belong only to her. The other thing began in the spring of 1886, and nobody organized it. Small stone structures started appearing at the exposed crossings along the Powder River Trail and on the ridges where travelers were known to get caught. Nothing elaborate. 3 or 4 walls of dry stacked sandstone roofed with heavy timbers closed on the windward side with a simple hinged door of thick oak, each one large enough for 4 or 5 people and an animal or 2 for a night. There was no committee behind them and no territorial authority. Freight drivers built the first few on their own initiative, hauling stone from the nearest bluff. Ranchers built more on their own land. A group of settlers north of KC built one together over a summer weekend. Nobody argued about how it should be done because everybody who built one had heard the story from a passing traveler, and everybody knew the principle. 3 walls of something stronger than you. 1 wall of whatever you have, sealed at every seam, and a gap left open at the top on the downwind end, 11 inches wide, which nobody could ever explain to a newcomer without telling the whole story of a girl coughing in the dark. By the winter of 1887, there were 11 along the Powder River Trail and 4 more on the road east toward the Belfourche. The number of winter deaths on those roads dropped in each of the 3 following years. It never reached 0. Wyoming is older and larger than any wall a person can build, but it was checked. And travelers who had once ridden that country with a kind of fatalism about winter began to ride it with something closer to caution instead. In the late fall of 1887, on a bright cold morning, with the first light snow already dusting the tops of the bighorns, Winifred saddled Thistle and rode north. Elsie Cutler came with her. The girl was 17 now, staying 2 weeks in Buffalo, the way she did twice every summer and once each fall. And she had been asking Winifred the kind of questions a young person asks when she has decided what sort of life she wants and needs to know how it gets built. They passed one of the new shelters late in the morning. Its walls were clean and square, its heavy oak door standing slightly ajar in the mild weather. A pile of firewood was stacked against the outside by some previous traveler. A tin cup hung from a nail beside the door. Winifred got down and went inside. The shelter was small, maybe 8 feet by 10, with a stone bench along one wall and a small hearth in the corner and a swept floor. Above the hearth, somebody had scratched a line into the mortar. "Leave it better than you found it." Winifred read it aloud slowly. "That's a good rule," she said. She took a package of dried apple slices out of her saddlebag and set it on the bench. Elsie added a length of match cord from her own kit and a small tin of tallow. They rode on. They reached the sandstone bluff in the late afternoon, with the sun already dropping toward the western bighorns and the shadows on the snow gone long and blue. Winifred drew up on the ridge above and sat her saddle a long moment looking down. The place looked exactly as it had that first afternoon. The 3 natural walls curving back into the cliff, the overhang throwing that same porch-shaped shadow across the packed sand inside. No sign at all of the wagon plank or the canvas or the packed grass. It was once again only a shadow in the rock. She dismounted and tied Thistle to the same twisted cedar and walked in. Elsie stayed at the entrance. Winifred stood in the middle of that sandstone floor and put her palm flat against the cool interior wall in the same place she had touched it 3 years earlier, and stood that way for a long while without speaking. Then she sat down on the packed sand in the corner where she had spent that night with her back against the stone. There was one more thing in her coat, and she took it out now. Elias's letter from the mussel shell, worn through at the folds into small white windows of nothing. She had carried it for 3 years and had not read it since the spring after he died. She did not open it now either. She only held it a moment and thought about a man who had been kind to a skinny 17-year-old boy. In the same summer, he was standing behind his own smokehouse with a stranger in a black coat, and who had carried the whole of it alone for 6 years because he could not stand for her to see him small. Then she pushed the letter down into the sand in the corner of the hollow deep and smoothed it over with her hand and left it there. Not out of anger. She had run out of that in the 2nd year. It was only that a person cannot carry every letter she has ever been given, and she had already decided which one she was going to keep. Elsie's voice came quietly from the entrance. "Did you ever open the other one again?" Winifred looked up. The girl was watching her with the same wide, serious eyes she had turned up in the dark of that night 3 years before. "Your father's letter," Elsie said. "The one you told me about last summer. Did you ever read it again after that night?" Winifred considered it. It was in its way the largest question Elsie had ever asked her. "No," she said, "I never did." "Why not?" Winifred looked around the sandstone walls one more time. "Because I didn't need to," she said. "My father wrote what he had to write, and I read it when I needed to read it. What he taught me isn't on that page anymore." She got up and came to the entrance. "It's in 11 stone shelters between here and the Belforche. It's in the way you're going to ride into weather for the rest of your life. It's in the way you loaded that mule this morning without being told." She shook her head slowly. "The letter did its work. I don't have to keep reading it to remember what it said." Elsie was quiet a moment. "Will you tell me the first line again?" Winifred smiled. "For the day you stand alone." The girl repeated it to herself without sound. Then she nodded once and stepped back to give Winifred one more moment inside. Winifred used it. She stood there with her hand on the cool rock and thought about her father, who had written a letter 4 times before he stopped burning it. About her mother, whose face she could not remember. About Cornelius Vantrees in a cell in Detroit, and found that she could think about him now with no heat at all. She thought about Wendell and Drusilla Prewitt, who had bought a small place outside Buffalo and came to supper at Ephraim's every second Sunday, and about Wendell teaching a hired boy to lay a foundation last spring by saying every measurement out loud. She thought about Absalom Coffey, who ran a livery in Sheridan now, with 8 fingers, and whose son Ned had ridden 200 miles alone at 15 last year for no reason except to shake her hand. She thought about Rufus Hollingsworth, whose arm had healed clean, and who had married a Sheridan girl and named his first son Barnaby, on Winifred's quiet recommendation after a grandfather he had never met. Then she walked out. The light had gone amber on the snow. She took Thistle's reins and turned once more to look at the shadow in the rock that had held 8 people on a November night in 1884, and she lifted her hand to it in a small salute, the same salute she had once seen her father give to a mountain he had crossed and did not intend to cross again. "Come on," she said. "2 hours back, and I want a warm kitchen by dark." They rode south together at an easy walk, the sun going down behind the bighorns on their right, their shadows stretching east across the snow. After a mile, Elsie broke the silence. "Aunt Winnie." Winifred had never asked her to use the word, and Elsie had never used it before, but it fit so naturally that Winifred did not remark on it. "Do you think we'll get another one like that, a storm that size?" Winifred thought about it. "Yes," she said honestly. "There'll be worse than that one before we're done. This country does not run out of weather." She glanced sideways at the girl. "But there'll be more shelters, and more people who know how to see one before it's finished." She faced forward again. "That's the whole trade of it. We don't stop the weather. We only get better at meeting it." The sun dropped behind the mountains, and the sky went first pink, then lavender, then a deep clean blue with the first hard stars showing over the eastern plain. Ahead of them, the lights of Buffalo began to appear one by one as lamps were lit in kitchen windows. Winifred turned in the saddle one last time and looked back north where the sandstone bluff was already lost in the gathering dusk. Somewhere out there, in the shadow of a hollow that had held for centuries a wall she had built with her own raw hands, had long since fallen back into the earth it came from. That was as it should be. The wall had never been the point. Her book went east on the Union Pacific in the spring of 1888 in a wooden crate addressed to a publisher in Boston, and came out the following year under a title 3 words long. What My Father Taught Me. It was never a bestseller by the standards of the eastern cities. It sold steadily across the western states and territories for the rest of her life and for many years after, and it became the kind of book a certain sort of frontier family kept on the shelf beside the family Bible and handed down when the older members died. Copies were still turning up in old Wyoming ranch houses in the middle of the following century, their pages soft with handling certain passages underlined by long-dead readers who had needed those particular words on some hard night of their own. There is a chapter in it, the 4th, that begins with a sentence people quoted for 50 years without knowing where it came from. "A weak wall with no openings will always beat a strong wall full of cracks." There is another line further in that fewer people quoted, but more people needed. Read the whole of it, especially the part he does not read to you. Winifred Ashcroft lived to be 79 years old. She never remarried, and she never had children of her own. Elsie Cutler ran freight out of Sheridan for 31 years and buried her in the small hillside cemetery above Buffalo in the spring of 1932 beside her brother Ephraim. The stone is plain. It bears her name and her dates in one short line beneath which she chose herself years before her death and left sealed in an envelope for Elsie to open when the time came. "For the day you stand alone." Long after the last person who had personally known her was gone, and long after the last of the original stone shelters along the Powder River Trail had crumbled back into rubble, the sandstone hollow itself remained. Wine still crosses that ridge every winter. Snow still buries the entrance in the worst of it. Cattle shelter inside during the summer thunderstorms that sweep the Wyoming plains. Now and then a hiker or a rancher or a curious child stands in its cool interior and puts a palm against the same wall she once touched and feels the same steady coolness that slowed a widow's breath after a long afternoon of running. Most of them will never know the story. The hollow does not require anybody to know it. The hollow requires only what it has always required, that someone come inside when the weather demands it, and that someone else, when the weather has passed, walk back out into whatever fresh morning is waiting.